Have you ever dreamed of traveling to outer space, walking on the moon? Do you wonder about what it would be like to go up in a rocket ship and see the Earth from space?
Yeah!
For generations, humans have looked up at the sky and wondered about what it would be like to go to space. Our ancestors mapped the stars and created stories about the sky. You've probably even heard some of those stories if you listened to our episode about the Aurora Borealis. In the 1950s and 60s, something called the space race started, and humanity stopped dreaming about space and started using science to make dreams of outer space a reality.
More on that later.
On July 20th, 1969, humans walked on the moon for the first time. American astronauts Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin were the first humans ever to land on the moon. A few hours after landing, Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. Do you know the famous quote he said as he took his first step?
I got nothing.
After stepping on the moon, Neil Armstrong said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
What a great quote!
These astronauts changed history by going to the moon, and it was part of the Apollo 11 mission. This mission took place 8 years after President John F. Kennedy announced a goal to Congress of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. Today, we're going to talk about this past moment from history, the Apollo 11 mission and the 1969 moon landing.
Let's get into it.
Here we go.
Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids.
And they're grown-ups, where we explore people, places, ponderings, and past moments from history that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Today's episode is all about the 1969 moon landing and the Apollo 11 mission that made it possible.
This was a historic moment.
It was, Cece. But as always, we can't just talk about the moment itself. History has so many intersecting factors. We have to take a step back and talk a little bit about the world and what led to the Apollo 11 mission.
That makes sense.
The journey to the moon was decades in the making, and there were so many people involved. Let's get a little context.
Check this out.
In 1961, President John Kennedy set a challenge to the United States Congress to send a man to the moon before the end of the 1960s.
Why, Mama?
President Kennedy set this goal because the U.S. wanted to win something called the space race.
What was that?
Remember the Cold War that we've talked about before? Well, the Cold War was a period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union after World War II. This was a time when both of these nations were trying to be the top world power. What we talk about as the space race actually started as an arms race between the two militaries of the United States and the Soviet Union.
What does that mean?
It basically means that both countries were trying to beat each other in having the best army, the best science, the best weapons, and the best advancement. It was a contest of who was better.
Got it.
In 1961, the Cold War was still going strong when President John F. Kennedy, or JFK, set his goal to send a man to the moon. At that point, the U.S. was kind of losing the space race to the Soviets, and this felt like a really big deal because of the ongoing Cold War. The Soviet Union successfully launched the Sputnik satellite on October 4th of 1957, and they beat the United States to space.
But that's not all.
You're right, Cece. The early years of the space race was all about who was first, because no one had ever gone to space before. So there were a lot of firsts to chase after.
Like what, Mama?
Well, things like who had the first satellite in space. As we just learned, that was the Soviets with their Sputnik satellite. But also things like who could send the first man to space, the first woman to space, who could do the first spacewalk, who was the first person to go to the moon. For the US, these early firsts were a series of defeats. The Soviet Union kept doing it first. First satellite, first man, first spacewalk. So the US was losing the space race, and they were determined to turn it around. For many Americans, when Americans landed on the moon first, they kind of thought of that as the end of the space race, which wasn't entirely true. The race to get to space slowed down a little after the first human landed on the moon in 1969. But keep in mind, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union continued on for another 20 years. If you listen to our episode about the Berlin Wall, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and Germany was reunified. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, and that's really when the Cold War ended. So quite a long time after the first person landed on the moon.
I remember hearing about that.
After the Berlin Wall fell, the US and Russia, which was formerly the Soviet Union, started partnering more cooperatively with all things space related. Now you've got a good idea of why this past moment of landing on the moon was such a big deal at the time. So now that we have all this context, we know a few things. Number one, the space race was in full swing alongside and within the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Number two, the US was trying to beat the Soviet Union to landing on the moon first. Number three, the US was behind.
There are a lot of things to keep track of.
You're right. That's why we take these moments to check in. Now, as we think about going to space, NASA is the government agency in the United States who is responsible for making space travel happen. Do you happen to know what NASA stands for, Cece? Is it A, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, B, the National Air Services Alliance, or C, the North American Space Adventure?
Mama, can I guess? The answer is A.
You're right. NASA, or the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was the organization responsible for the United States' efforts in space travel. NASA was created in response to the early success the Soviet Union was having in the space race, and NASA still exists today.
I learned something new today.
NASA officially opened on October 1st of 1958. Just 6 days after NASA formally started, America's first human spaceflight program began, and this was called Project Mercury. There were several projects and missions that NASA did before the Apollo mission that actually sent a man to the moon, which is the past moment we're talking about today. The early missions of Project Mercury had manned flights that happened from May of 1961 to May of 1963. During that time, NASA launched 6 missions from Cape Canaveral. Project Mercury was the United States' first human spaceflight program, and it was really important for the ability for humans to eventually land on the moon just a few years later.
I wish I could have seen that.
After Project Mercury came another NASA project. This one was called Gemini. Project Gemini happened between the Mercury program and the Apollo program. And remember, the Apollo program is what put the first human on the moon. So to help you keep it straight, you can think about it like this. Project Mercury sent astronauts to space for longer periods of time than ever before. This allowed NASA to learn more about space's effects on the human body. NASA needed to understand this to get ready to send humans to the moon. The Gemini program, which came after Project Mercury but before the Apollo project, flew 10 crews to space. And this included feats like the first U.S. spacewalk.
That is quite the achievement.
Yes, NASA needed Projects Mercury and Gemini to make the Apollo mission possible.
Good to know.
Now that we've got all that straight, let's focus on the past moment we're talking about today, the Apollo 11 mission.
Tell me everything!
On July 16th, 1969, Apollo 11 launched from Cape Kennedy. The men on board were Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin. This mission that took U.S. astronauts to the moon was NASA's 5th crewed Apollo mission.
Here's a fun fact.
Hundreds of thousands of people traveled to Cape Kennedy to watch the launch live.
I had no idea.
Even thousands more watched the launch on their TVs. After they launched, the astronauts completed an orbit or a loop around the Earth before heading to the moon. These astronauts had to travel 240,000 miles in just 76 hours, or a little over 3 days.
That's a big number.
It's massive, Cece. Apollo 11 entered into a lunar orbit on July 19th. So like I said, took them right around 3 days to get from Earth to the moon's orbit.
How incredible. That's amazing.
The spaceship that traveled from Earth to the moon had two parts. There was the command module, which was called Columbia, and the lunar module, which was called the Eagle. On the morning of July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin crawled from the command module Columbia through a little tunnel to the lunar module Eagle.
Can you explain that to me?
Sure, Cece, check this out. The Apollo 11 command module Columbia was the living quarters for the three-person crew while they traveled through space, and it's the part of the ship that eventually returned to Earth. The lunar module was the two-person craft that was used by Armstrong and Aldrin, and it was designed specifically to land on the moon's surface.
That is cool.
Armstrong and Aldrin piloted the Eagle to the moon's surface. They landed in a part of the moon known as the Sea of Tranquility.
Then what happened?
At 4:17 p.m. U.S. Eastern Daylight Time, Commander Neil Armstrong said over the radio, "The Eagle has landed." So if you've ever heard someone say that before, now you know where the quote comes from.
Fancy.
At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped out onto the moon's surface, and he said his famous quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin stepped out onto the moon a few minutes later. Now, you may be wondering, what did the astronauts even do on the moon, other than being the first to land there?
Really? Spill the tea.
Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent 21 hours and 36 minutes on the moon's surface. The astronauts carried out important experiments while on the surface of the moon. They also picked up bits of moon dirt and rocks to bring back to Earth to be studied. On the moon, they left behind an American flag, a patch honoring the Follow Apollo 1 crew, and a plaque on one of the Eagle's legs.
What does it say?
The plaque reads, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind."
We talked about a lot.
We sure did, Cece. Here are some final facts about the 1969 Apollo 11 moon landing.
Fact number 1.
About 400,000 people worked on the Apollo 11 mission, but there were only 3 astronauts who traveled: Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin.
Fact number 2.
It cost NASA around $25 billion to send the Apollo 11 mission to the moon.
Fact number 3.
It took 4 days, 6 hours, and 45 minutes to travel the 240,000 miles to get to the moon. By the time the crew landed back on Earth, the mission had taken 8 days, 3 hours, 18 minutes, and 35 seconds. President Kennedy never got to see his dream of landing on the moon come true, as he was killed in 1963, 6 years before we landed on the moon.
What was your favorite fact?
When the astronauts returned to Earth, they splashed down in the ocean. They entered the Earth's atmosphere going super fast, 24,000 miles per hour to be exact.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, that's way faster than your mom and dad probably drive.
Ha ha ha.
The Apollo 11 landed in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii on July 24th, 1969. The spacecraft that went to the moon is now located at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C.
That is cool.
While the Apollo 11 mission was the first moon landing, it wasn't the last. A total of 12 people have walked on the moon since the 1969 landing. The Apollo 11 mission proved the space and scientific capabilities of the United States to the world and laid the groundwork for future space travel and progress. This past moment is an example of what can happen when people come together to dream big and imagine what might be possible. Believe it or not, humanity has now explored more of outer space than we have of our oceans here on the planet Earth. And even though the space race is over, there continue to be new discoveries and trips to the moon and beyond. If you listen to our podcast regularly, you know we don't just like talking about people, places, and past moments from history.
We also love to rhyme.
We wrote you a poem about the Apollo 11 mission and the 1969 moon landing.
Here we go.
In space, the astronauts of Apollo 11 flew. From Earth to the moon, they went where no one knew. Racing for history, they landed on the moon. The first step was over too soon. Aldrin, Armstrong, and Collins, a crew unlike any before, landed on July 20th and opened the door. They came back safe thanks to NASA and team. A space race challenge, a living dream. Thanks for listening to another episode of Check This Out. Here at the Check This Out podcast, we know there's a lot of information, and it can be overwhelming to find accurate information online. This podcast is a tool for you to help you do something called citing your sources. As you get older and do projects for school, you'll learn that certain types of websites or information sources aren't verified or have evidence and documentation to back them up. On Check This Out, we use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. Verified sources are materials or information that have been confirmed for accuracy and credibility through an evaluation process. If you search in places like an AI tool, always make sure to validate whatever it tells you by looking at verified sources. Our sources for this week's episode are NASA, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, History.com, Encyclopedia Britannica, the BBC, and National Geographic. In our next episode, we will be talking about the past moment at the start of the French Revolution. So please join us for another exciting episode.
Thanks for listening. See you next episode. Don't forget to subscribe.